Recording that. All right, so we had a little discussion. We're trying to figure out our agenda for those of you who are watching. Let me share this document too. Share. Okay. Just make sure I have notifications turned off. It's the worst. Good. Okay. So let's see. So essential to answer your question, what I thought about function. I don't know. I thought it might, to talk about how they would like take try-blocks. That's maybe the easiest one. But where would the discussion start? Where would it be hosted? What would be how could we control if we were going to have stages or phases? What are those stages or phases, and how can we control the focus? And like in particular, I think the thing I would want to talk about was like if the goal is, let's say, to start by enumerating use cases or something, then what is the role of a central Lang team meeting in making
I don't think my understanding of try-blocks is that we are blocked on deciding whether we want to wrap or not. And that's the only thing that stops us from actually stabilizing.
Yeah, I think I meant try more generally, but like take try functions then or something. I mean, I don't want to get into the I'm not proposing it because I want to talk about the details of the future, but more like,
sure.
Would we go about addressing an ergonomic concern that is controversial or something like that, to try to get into what might the process be. But
so enumerating use cases seem good, but I think this feature try functions would be so pervasively used in the language if we added them. So adding use cases is sort of it's so easy that it becomes hard to do. Does that make sense? But it mostly feels like a style of writing code question.
Maybe it's it occurs to me that I see what you're saying, first of all, but it occurs to me that maybe it's useful to zoom out and just lay out, like, I'm not sure if my assumption is universally shared, but I have a kind of process in mind and I'd like to sort of fit it to the things and see if it seems like it's going to work. Very briefly, what that would be, I think, but somehow we decide to start a WG, a working group, and that I'd like to talk about in a bit, or that we should also talk about. But initially, it is in an exploratory phase where you're sort of looking at the problem, enumerating. Maybe use cases isn't quite the right word, but I think like key examples.
Yes. I think that fits better in this case.
Yeah. Key examples of what you're trying to address, and sketching out possible ways to address and their effect on the examples. And I think as much as possible, I would like this phase to be positive. Like, we often have this kind of, try to have the sort of attitude of we're trying to elaborate all the things. So even if you think it's a bad idea, it's a good thing to explore it. Because
I think the fitting word here is we want to brainstorm, basically.
Yes. And then somehow, this is the part I'm not exactly sure where it happens. I think that, well, first of all, I think this exploratory phase might actually be the end result of a working group a lot of times, not just because we don't want to do the idea, like maybe because you could imagine commissioning a group to explore and not expecting to go further. And at least not at this time. I have some examples of things where I feel like I would like someone to go think out what would happen, even though I don't think it'd be a good idea to do the work at this moment. But then if you do decide to go further, then I think somehow there needs to be like an RFC-like thing, a motion for selecting the vague shape of one of these solutions and putting it on the table, and that's to be elaborated. And how detailed that shape has to be, I don't know. But
so something that I really liked in the blog post you posted a couple of weeks ago, Nico, was the part where you talked about agreeing on the problems.
Yeah.
I'm not quite seeing that here yet. It would be very nice if that was like an explicit step that is taken. Like, hey, we see exactly these problems, and then we can talk about solutions for those problems.
I see. So like, I sort of imagined that being,
or challenges, maybe. I don't know.
I think you have to be iterative with respect to problems and solutions. But in some cases, one solution might solve more problems than you are trying to solve right now, and that is a good thing. And if you only look at the problems you're trying to solve, you might end up with quite an ad hoc addition to the language, which I personally think is a bad idea oftentimes.
Sure, I'm not advocating for talking about solutions in isolation. I'm just thinking of like, how can we what kind of artifacts can we produce? And something that seems very valuable is at least getting a sense of like, hey, these are the problems that we're trying to solve.
Mm-hmm. I thought that would be, so I wrote the problem and key examples, but what I meant by that was really the problems, first of all, and like I sort of envisioned that being the output of this exploratory phase, is like, here are a bundle of related problems, and here's some key examples that can help you understand them. And here is a subset of the possible subset. Like here are some different solutions that may or may not solve all the problems, right? And somewhere there has to be a choice. That's the transition I see, is like out of that, you then say, okay, and that's the role of the team, essentially, is to say, okay, we like this one best, right? And here's why. And that's presumably an interactive process also of like,
right, because I
don't have consensus on it, but
I think like a dialectic model works well, where you sort of, we have problems, we find a way, we find some solutions to those solutions might highlight other problems, and then we iterate on that.
One other thing I think that comes to mind, wait, sorry, first of all, what did you just say? You have problems, solutions, they may cause other problems. Oh, I see. Like the solutions themselves come with problems somehow, or?
No, like we are considering some problem. We found some solutions, but when in thinking about those solutions, we found other problems.
I see. Yeah, I expect the set of problems to grow as we go. Is that what you mean?
Yes.
I think it'll happen both ways, like new problems and spark off new solutions.
Yes.
But there is also some question that has to be answered of like justifying why this is a problem we want to fix, or part of the transition, I guess, is deciding that indeed, like the problem is worth solving at all. I think that will come up for sure when we're talking about like ergonomic things and so on. But it comes up for everything, really. Not sure how. I feel like it would be good to acknowledge that explicitly, like justify that explicitly somehow, but I don't know what that means exactly.
I mean, we do that already, but not in a staged fashion.
Right.
I think.
I mean, in some sense, it's basically saying why we don't think the downsides of the solution are bad enough to block it. That's kind of what we're saying. But does that answer your question, Yash? Like, do you think that's enough of agreeing on the problems, or do you think there's a way to highlight that better?
Good question. It's probably fine, right? Like, yeah, it's probably fine.
At least it feels like, if nothing else, this process would ensure that we have a common set of examples and problems, right? We may not get agreement on that those were the most important, but.
So one other thing I would like to highlight is that in terms of like, sometimes you have RFCs that are like purely consistency fixes. They might not be motivated by key examples, but they might be motivated by simply making the syntax more uniform or removing special cases that are like hacks in the compiler. And they're not, then the motivation is not we want to unlock something for users, but rather we want to remove technical debt and something. And that might be the problem in that case. So it's not.
Yeah, I think it would be fine to say, like, the problem is these two things are really inconsistent. And your case would be strengthened if you can say, and this leads to this and that confusion or something. But in general, like, inconsistency is a problem. I agree.
Yeah. I'd argue that, like, for those still, like, having motivating examples is very important. Like, it's very, like, to prevent sort of hand wavy. Not saying that anyone's doing that, but like making sure that there's like no hand waving of like, oh, it's now more consistent. Like, what does that mean? Why is that important? Why are we adding these things? If you can point to compiler code that's bad, then that's great, right? Or like motivating cases of like, hey, look at this and look at this, and this is very weird. It's like, oh, cool, that makes sense. But I think the process might still apply for those, actually.
Yeah, I agree that making the syntax more uniform or removing special cases, like those special cases could be the key examples for why you do that.
Sometimes it's really hard to find. It often works quite well to find the key examples, even for users, when you are trying to remove special cases. But sometimes it's like really difficult to do this.
But like, if there's no motivating use case, then why is that being proposed? Like, it's hard to get people along or involved if it's like, well, we're doing it for reasons, and you know, what are those reasons? And then
because
yeah.
we're simplifying, like we're like simplifying grammar, we're simplifying the type system, we're removing hacks to make like the language easier to specify, etc.
It seems like you should be able to show, like, you can show the use cases that didn't work, or you can show the grammar. I don't know. I agree. Sometimes it's hard, and I think that's like why it's actually important. Because if it's hard for you to even explain what is the improvement, then people will not see it. But
sure. I mean, you can in that case, it probably is easier to just show a diff of the grammar and like, boom, it was super complex before and now it's super simple.
Right. And I think it's a legit pushback to say, who cares how complex the grammar is? But like, not that simplistic, but to say that alone, like, if it has follow-on effects that are confusing, like if the syntax was that complex for a reason, that is something we should consider. But if there is no good reason, then okay. But that's the role of this whole point, is to like get through that and put it to bed in some sense. One thing I've heard from TC39 members on TC39, the JavaScript committee, is that the staging process has a lot of really strong benefits, but it also has the effect that sometimes, like, it's hard to stop like that. There's a lot of momentum behind changes. That's a good thing. but it's also a bad thing. And that's partly why I brought up why the problem is worth fixing. I do think it's something we want to think about so that we're not making more changes than we.
I can add a bit to that because I've done a lot of JavaScript. Like it's been most of my entire career before Rust. And I've also talked to TC39 members about sort of their process. And like two things kind of stand out to me that I feel might be worth adding is first off, they have a very easy way of adding new grammar, new features, new anything to JavaScript, because pretty much everyone's using the Babel toolchain. And so they just opt into these features and then they're using it in the production code base. So it's kind of hard to stop it once everyone's like already using it, because now it's in production and you can't really roll it back. And it's like, oh God, how do we move from here? And the second thing is, from talking to members, is that they really are starting to try to go into user research, actually test out, like, for example, ergonomic changes, to be like, hey, how do people react to this? What do people find here? So they're hiring firms to do that for them, because they see a lot of value in it, because oftentimes there's, like, even for JavaScript, they get very little feedback.
Yeah, I've wanted to think about that as well.
I don't think we have any kind of resources to do that.
I mean, I think we got a lot of there's a lot of low-hanging fruit before we bring in consultants, but I do think it's something we could think about at some point.
I think especially for quote-unquote controversial ergonomics changes, getting sort of the user impact, or at least getting a feel for that, whichever way we get that, would seem very valuable.
Yeah, definitely. My concern, I mean, the concern is you want to do it right. Like, I think random polls is not great, but hiring firms or working with people who've got a lot of experience and is much better.
Yes, and sometimes you want to sort of change how users interact with the language, and not just like.
So one of the things on that note, though, that I've wanted to see us doing is earlier on developing things like explainers from the beginning, and versus it being like something which is known to happen. It's like, okay, we're done stabilizing, now let's write the docs, because writing the docs like shapes the feature. If you find it's hard to explain what's happening, then you might revisit your opinion about how important something is and so on. Even though it is also going to be more work, because you're writing semi-polished explainers for stuff that's going to change. But
I agree with that.
We already sort of do this in the guide level explanations. We just need to reformat the format or the template somewhat. I think.
I agree. I think it should be. I don't think those guide level explanations. Well, okay, I agree. We already sort of do it. I just think it should be like a separate document in a repo that is actually, like, people can actually go to it to understand the design.
Sure.
Kind of. I don't know. I think we do it in the right direction, and we should just do more.
Right.
To that end, one thing I wanted to mention is, like, people, just that I think it would be great if we said, when you go to active phase, you should have a few people involved, and they should be, like, a few roles filled, and one of them should be explainer person, and one of them should be implementer, which we already talked about.
Right. It's good that you have those roles, but it just to. I think it doesn't have to. It can be the same person that does both.
I actually don't. I think that's an interesting question. I don't know. Like, it could be, but I would like us to.
I think it depends on how big the language feature is. If you're talking about async await or const generics, absolutely. But if you're talking about some, like, we're allowing attributes in this small new position in the language, okay, then then one person can do both.
I agree that for smaller changes, it makes sense. I'm thinking more, I want it to avoid us spreading ourselves too thin, and I want us to like have more resiliency. So if that, sometimes that means, yeah, like even though someone maybe could do it, trying to find more people so that they get more points of view. But I agree that like, yeah, for some, I think I'm thinking more about working across working groups, that I would really like to push back on that. But
my concern here is that we have a lot of things to implement and a lot of technical debt, and adding too much, like there has to be multiple people who does it, that could add overhead and slow things down. And we want to solve these problems.
I want to slow things down, I think. But
I agree for new design, but we still have a bunch of old stuff.
Yeah.
I definitely agree with slowing things down these days. I didn't used to, but I do now.
I feel like Aron hasn't said much recently. Do you have?
Yeah, no, I full agreement. Like,
okay,
just listen.
Let's leave. Yeah. This is the kind of thing where I think even though I sort of favor stricter rules, or I'm arguing for them, I wouldn't want to start with them anyway. So I'm happy to leave it for now. But I think even just writing down who the roles are, and saying that this is the roles is great. And if we wind up sort of seeing patterns that are problematic, we can try to address them. But
so maybe we can enumerate some roles now.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
So someone implements the feature in the compiler. Someone reviews the implementation. Someone makes explanations for users. Someone documents the thing in the reference, which is quite different from writing the end user documentation.
You're on the wrong URL there, but
it's different in content, but how much does the same responsibility fall into both roles? Like, how much does when you write one, like how much can you just reuse that for the reference, or vice versa?
I think it depends.
Not much.
Yeah.
It's hard to reuse the text, but you can reuse having either makes it easier to write the other. I think.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Yeah, not the text itself, but rather having written the reference thing. Does that make you more capable or better suited to then write the end user explainer?
I think it can be, but I think it can also work. It depends. If it's complicated to write the reference, then you might have tunnel vision in terms of the technical details and not see like, how do we explain this to users? Like, you are too much of an expert to explain things. There's the people who write the Rust book are not the same people who write the reference.
Call it the curse of knowledge, but yeah.
Yeah.
I don't know how much it has to be different people, but it's definitely a different mindset.
Yes.
The one thing I would bring up is test cases. We brought that up as a sort of formal deliverable. I think that kind of falls out from the.
I'm actually rather. I'm starting to become more and more concerned about tests. I think async await is a good example. We have sort of a deadline for 1.37, but I think it's a highly untested feature, and at least I think we shouldn't ship untested things. It sort of feels like existential type to me, not as untested, but gives me the same sort of.
Yeah, so that has bearing on, from the compiler team's point of view, like the maintenance burden of is obviously significantly improved if we have tests, because you know when you break stuff or before you land the PR.
Also from a language point, like the specification, the tests are not just like we want to make sure things don't change. We also want to know how things work. So also from the language team perspective, I think it's extremely important and undervalued.
So something that I haven't quite heard so far is writing blog posts. I guess it's kind of like taken for granted because some people just do it. But if we're going to define roles, it seems important to, because they're just so valuable.
Yeah, no, you're totally dead on. That's like one of the hardest things, external communication and keeping it up. I mean, I would say for that matter,
depends on the size of the feature, I think. If it's something like, oh, and by the way, we fixed this. We didn't even mention it on the blog post for the release, then it's probably not that important.
You're probably right there, but there's a lot of things that are very important that are not being like communicated as clearly externally as they could be. So I'd like.
Do you have anything in mind?
So for example, existential types. I have like no idea what the process is. What's going on there? I don't know, right?
Like they have bugs. They have lots of bugs.
Sure. I'm not too interested in details right now, but it's I feel there's lots of stuff going on. I follow This Week in Rust and I follow like all the PRs. But it's kind of like clicking through and seeing what's going on. I don't really know the thinking behind it. Whereas with Async Await, like Boats' series was really good. The series about futures from 2 years ago is still being referenced by Aaron and Alex, right? So there's some artifacts that you're seeing that are so extremely valuable that, I don't know.
Yeah, I think like regular posts that are like, here's our roadmap, here's where we are in the roadmap, here's what happened since the last time, some this use case we decided to drop from the roadmap, this one became more important, here's why. We finished up that feature. It's not even that hard to do, but it's super. People are dying for that information.
I need to set up a blog.
My hope was that these posts would fall out to some extent from. Like I wanted a process that involved somewhat regular check-ins with the Lang team, and the intention was that those check-ins, you need them to make progress, but also you need them. They produce material. Like in order to do one, to schedule one, you need a blog post first that you can cite and put on the schedule. And that was to force this.
I don't know that we need a blog post.
I think you need a blog post. A written document that we can post on our Lang team blog. Let's put it that way.
That's very different from a blog post. Blog posts have a very special form.
I mean, it's a blog post. It's a post on a blog.
No, blog posts are like personal and stuff, I feel.
Whatever.
Weblog post?
We're nitpicking. But the point is, I think we should have regular updates. I think it's great if they go on people's personal blogs. I think it's
I agree with that.
Also okay if there's a Lang team blog that's giving them. In fact, we probably want that. But something else I brought in which is related to blog posts, but there's, I think, like meetings in general, meeting summaries is a lot of work. It's not probably a role that needs to be assigned in the same way. It's just work. And in some ways, this list is sort of both roles and work to be done. But
summarizing meetings of what? Of language team meetings? Or?
Yeah, I assume most of this design, like people have discussions, right? It might be a formal meeting. It might be a couple. But it needs to be like summarized and surfaced up.
Actually, that's really good. I sometimes hear like from, for example, C++, that someone's like, oh, why was this arcane feature done as X and Y? And there's like notes from a decade ago and they get to find them. And no,
Right.
yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, sometimes you can actually archaeology.
That is fun.
So, I'm trying to think. I feel like we just said a lot of things that I didn't take notes on. And speaking of summarizing, I will not remember. There was some discussion about, like, I guess, trying to make status updates more a part of the process, like personal blogs versus Lang team blog. So, okay. I mean, one thing I definitely hear, speaking of async await, pretty frequently, like I think there's been a lot of great blog posts, but it's also a poster child for it's impossible to find the reasoning that went into a lot of the decisions unless you like go to some repo in a different GitHub org and find the right issue in the comment and so on, right? And that seems to come up with summarizing meetings, but
I think that's also a more general issue of triage, like centralizing links and stuff. If you have some more central location that links to a bunch of different things, so that you don't have to click 10 different times to reach something and do the archaeology yourself, then it's easier.
So-
part of that falls on the release team.
can we try to apply some of these thoughts to an example? I feel like that would be helpful.
Do you want to?
I don't care which one, but
It probably applies differently between these.
agreed. But we should start with one.
Yes.
Let's take try functions, not try blocks. Does everyone? I don't know, Yash or Aaron. Do you know what I mean by try functions?
I don't know what you mean by try functions. I do know try blocks.
Okay, so just real briefly, there was the problem, I guess, is sort of the frequency of code like this. And there are various proposals around how one might solve it. One of them is something like this. But I think like we're already seeing some of the things. So I imagine such a discussion here would begin with sort of establishing the problem roughly in this form. There's probably some more examples. There are definitely more. And iterate over various proposals. I think one of the big questions that has arisen, and I'm curious how we should dive into this. When we discuss this, we often get into questions of like, how helpful is it for people to get the type errors in order to like establish the mental model of, like in order to clarify for them what is happening when there's a result. How important is it that they write this okay explicitly versus not, and what makes for a smoother learning experience? Those are questions that have arisen that I don't think have simple answers, and I'm curious, like, could want to go on?
I'd argue there's like another problem. Like if I were to like discuss this in earnest, I'd be like, oh, but the std error type is weird because it doesn't implement sync. That's something people also run into. Should that also be fixed by this? Which goes back to like, do we agree on the same problems?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, that's a good point. So it might be that the scope is too small.
Yeah.
That this would be because I totally agree that error handling, like actually error handling is just a problem area, and that needs to be addressed in a lot of, and it involves laying and libs probably, but that's okay. So maybe let's change it. Let's say we all agreed on that. If we were saying then that the problem is error handling, that's actually pretty interesting because it feels like it could help diffuse some of the controversy by letting us like really agree on a much bigger set of examples, and we might, I don't know. I think it could either give more context to the syntax, or it could lead to the syntax being de-emphasized because there are more urgent pressing problems that need to be solved, and we work on those first. And either is probably okay. But
I feel that this example is tricky because it requires already having thought about the problems of error handling, which I don't know if everyone has here currently. I would assume, I just don't know.
I mean, there is, I assume there are many different problems with error handling.
Mm-hmm.
And I assume I have thought about some and not about others.
I think part of what the error handling example gives rise to is that there probably isn't a solution, right? Like where I said something earlier about like sketching out the general shape of the solution to the problem, but there's probably like a number of problems with different solutions. There are subparts of this, right? And that seems okay and normal. I don't know whether we may or may not want to like select them all in advance. Maybe that means that there would be some like distinction where then if you want to do a specific thing within that space, you kind of focus on that. But like I think that I had expected the working groups to be larger than a single RFC, and I wanted to bring that up. And I felt like one of the first things that would be done is prioritizing a sort of roadmap of what are the subparts.
I think that's a good idea. I think having like traits is a good example. I think that's a reasonable working group. I don't think it does too much.
I mean, in that case, it might be that, like, but traits is also so big, like you can't enumerate. Well, it actually would be pretty useful. We haven't done this work, and I think we should. We've sort of half done it, but like it would be useful for us to spend the time doing this motivational key examples thing and really enumerating out like here are the set of problems we see and the most burning ones, and here's a bunch of other problems that we're not aiming to solve right now. I suspect maybe we should. It's also an interesting example because a lot of that stuff is implementation blocked, which
stuff?
A lot of the work are on traits.
Okay.
Like there's some of both, right?
There's a bunch of stuff that isn't. You could do a bunch of new design in parallel, but we don't want to right now. Like, not this year.
Sort of separate from this, something I'm currently trying out, not quite by myself, but is try out implementations separate outside the compiler just to prove an idea. Be like, hey, like with proc macros, can we prove that something works? Currently, like arguments in main is one thing. Another thing that I got to work is doc comments as dot context for errors. I got that working today. Another one that may be possible with the right amount of like waving around is throw as a keyword in argument position, or I don't know, try functions. I don't know. Something there feels interesting.
So I think in those cases, the fundamental limitations of proc macros are sort of known. It's good to experiment, but there are limits to what you can learn with Plot macros.
Yes, you are correct. Just seems useful in like some of those limited cases to be able to do that.
Sure.
I think there are limits, and also but also it may be a perfectly satisfactory solution in some cases. Right? I've definitely thought about if we had try blocks, one could add a try decorator to a function pretty darn easily in the standard library, and like definitely that might even just be adequate, right? It might be enough to show how, like, at least to run experiments, or alternatively, it might be enough to run experiments and convince people of the utility or lack thereof. Right? So I guess that's just something to keep in mind, that especially with proc macros, we have a lot of flexibility there in some cases. So
I think so. Sometimes proc macros are input to RFC designs. If we take, I have one example, which is default field values, which was RFC'd before, but I sort of have a new one. And there are a bunch of different proc macros which have been input to, or at least examples in the RFC. There is like the new, derive new, and derive, etc. Crates that already exist in the builder crates. So yeah, proc macros are useful when they exist as input.
So here's a few things that are on my mind, although we're running out of time. I guess we're running out of time, so we should think about what to do next time. But some things I think we didn't kind of talk about that I'm thinking about are how to have difficult conversations. Like kind of skirted around it, but
and by difficult, I assume you mean controversial, and not just like, oh, here's a bit of complex type theory we need to think through.
I think I mean both, actually. I did mean controversial, but I like your how to manage deeply technical conversations too. I think it's kind of interesting. Maybe it's maybe not so important. The other thing was just the how do we select what to target? But the other thing was the stages, and do we want some kind of like what formal staging mechanism, and what is it? You sort of talked about it, but I don't think we dug deeply into it.
With respect to formal staging, maybe add some point about and how we can skip steps when we feel it's appropriate for something specific. Like, this is really simple. We don't need to do all the process because it's a waste of time.
Sure. Anyone have thoughts on what other things that were on their mind that didn't get talked about, or thoughts on what we could talk about next time?
Conflict resolution. Sometimes people don't get along, and how do you solve that?
Yeah, and this how to have controversial conversations feels sort of connected to me for like overall working group procedure. Like I think we want to have like a standardish procedure that sort of doesn't have to be required, but that's like there's a repository or not, or there's an area for documents. There's do we have like meetings or not? Is it
another one that we talked during all hands is scheduling breaks between large features, getting the cadence of the working groups right.
Mm.
It doesn't feel like you always have to be logged in or else you might miss things.
Right. So I guess that's like a, well, they're not feel. So there's the cadence, and then the not feeling like feels like there is another topic that is kind of, we sort of touched on the idea of a LangTeam block, but like if we want some official notification mechanism that we can follow, but I sort of approach that also with how do we select what to do and when. I don't know if you agree with that. I put it under there because it seems like that's when we will take that into account. Like that's not the right time for this because we should wait.
That's an interesting discussion about breaks and cadence. The one point I would like to make is that like, if some people miss things, that's okay. Not everyone has to follow everything, and not everyone is interested in everything. And like the people who care about everything might not be the people who we are trying to target most actively.
I feel there's a lot of assumptions there that I don't necessarily agree with, but also we're kind of out of time, so I don't want to engage too much. But
sure,
we should talk about that.
Sure.
One thing I'd like to mention is we should talk about like when should a working group end? Like working groups currently could technically go on forever because some topics are potentially infinite, but sometimes ones to just stop, and new ones should arise from their finished work rather than maintaining the same one all the time in certain cases.
Yeah, I like that. I like the idea of, okay, we gotta go.
I think it's also a how should a working group end, not just when.
All right.
All right, I have to run to another meeting.
Thanks.
Cool.
That's good.
Nico, on a separate issue, did you have a chance to look at the if thingy?
Hold on, I'm gonna end the recording.